Hello and welcome back to my project of the sampler quilt. Glad to have you with me as we get together to make block number 4 for this sampler quilt. And as you can see, block 4 is called Sweet Tweets. And it's really an interesting block. It looks a lot more complex than it actually is. You see the name of the designer there, Angie, let's see, Hot App. And so we're going to make this block. I want you to pay special attention to what the block is really made of. You can see that it has a square in the middle, that black square. And if you look closely, you will see that the black square is surrounded by rectangles. Here's one rectangle. Here's the next rectangle that goes across here, stops at the edge of the square and comes back. Here is the third rectangle that starts here at the edge of the bottom edge of the square and it comes to the top. And then here is the fourth rectangle that surrounds the center square. Each rectangle has been cut in half on the diagonal. So here is one diagonal of this rectangle, and here is the other diagonal of the same rectangle. And because it has been it has been separated on the diagonal, we get 4 triangles out of that rectangle. Triangle number 1 that matches this triangle, so these are both triangle 1. And then here is triangle 2 that matches the triangle right there. And if you look at it very carefully, that really is what you need to know in order to construct this block. Also, keep in mind that because this is going to finish as a 12.5-inch block, that tells me that I can do some things to help myself in putting this together. Now, if you have the book, you know that the book says you need to have 2 templates. One template is for triangle 1, here, 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 here. And also in the gold here, there, 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 and there. That's triangle A. Then we also need triangle B, and you should be able to see that. Here's a triangle B, and here is a triangle B directly in front of it. The white here is a triangle B, and the dark print is a triangle B, and it continues around the block. Triangle B, triangle B. And here's our last one. Triangle B, triangle B. Keep that in mind because that's going to help you with constructing or making your own templates. You don't need to have the template that came with this on the CD. If you just visually take the block apart, you can create your own template, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now. You will need graph paper. And the graph paper can be a graph paper that has 1/4 of an inch squares or 1/2 of an inch square. That's what I used. I prefer this one for a lot of projects. Or your graph paper can have a 1-inch square. And when you have finished with the graph paper and you're going to want to stabilize or make your template nice and stiff, one of the things you can use is an old folder. I keep lots of old folders. They help tremendously. If you have quilter's template plastic, that will work. And in a minute, you'll see that I am going to make the templates out of cardboard. So here is what we need to do. And once again, as you look at this block, remember we have 12 inches in this block. That square in the middle is 4 inches. That tells me that I've got 4 inches here and 4 inches there, which is very vital to figuring out how to make the template. If I look at from this edge to the edge of the black square, that has to be 8 inches because it encompasses two 4-inch spaces. So this has to be 8 inches. And I know that because I've got 4 inches left over here since I'm working with a 12-inch square, so 12-inch block. So I need a rectangle that is 4 inches wide and 8 inches long. And I need to make sure you understand where I got those numbers. I can look at this, I can see that the square in the middle is a 4-inch square. If that square is 4 inches, then the space on this side of the square is 4 inches, and the space on this side of the square is 4 inches, because I have to have that in order to equal 12. The same thing here and here. Knowing that, then I have a 4-inch space and a 4-inch space, and that gives me an 8-inch rectangle times 4-inch rectangle, so 8 by 4. So what we want to do is take our graph paper, and in this case I'm using the 1/2 inch graph paper, and you can see that I have put dots. I counted, since this is 1/2 inch graph paper, I know that every 2 squares on the graph paper equal 1 inch. So I need 8 squares in order to get the 8, I need eight of these little squares in order to get 4 inches here. Let me say that again. My graph paper has 1/2 inch squares. That means this is a 1/2 of an inch, that's a 1/2 of an inch. The two together make 1 inch. And in that case, I have to have 8 of these to make 4 inches. And I counted over 8 and I put a dot, and you can see the dot. Then I had to do the same thing to get the 8 inches down. Every 2 squares on this graph paper equals an inch. So to get 8 inches in length, I counted 16 squares, and there is the dot. And here is the last dot. And I did it on the edge because I'm going to eventually cut it out. And why stick it in the middle of the paper when you can just as easily put it on the edge and you have only 3 sides really to cut out. But that's neither here nor there. You will put it on your graph paper where it's best for you. Okay, so I've marked off the space. And the next thing I did, I used my ruler to connect those dots that I had put on the paper. And I wrote the red just to show you what dimensions we're working with. Once again, we have a length of 8 inches, and so that says 8 inches there. And we have a width of 4 inches, and so I've written a 4 there. And so now I've got my rectangle that I need, that I'm going to get my templates from. The next thing you have to do in order to get the templates that you need is draw 2 diagonals through the rectangle. And you want to be as accurate as you possibly can be. Remember, eventually these will be templates. You will be using them to cut out your fabric. So you want to start out with an accurate template so that you're not cutting your fabric incorrectly. And one of the ways you can assure yourself that you have been accurate is, look right here in the middle. Those 2 diagonals meet in the middle of your rectangle, and they also meet on the middle line. If you have a convergence of your two diagonals and that middle line in the rectangle, your diagonals are drawn correctly. And that's what you truly want. Now that I have it drawn, I'm going to cut it out. And I can cut it out using paper scissors. One of the things I found that I truly like is I put an old dull blade in my rotary cutter. And I keep one just for this purpose. Whenever I have to cut paper, I use an old blade in the rotary cutter. I just save one. You wrap it up, make sure you put it where you can't cut yourself when you're, rummaging around looking for things. But I have an old blade in my rotary cutter. And I'm going to use that old blade along with my ruler to make sure I cut on the line. And I'll demonstrate that for you. Let me find my ruler. Oh. Okay, I need to stand up for this. But when you're doing this, use the ruler to make sure you are on the line. And I hope you used your ruler to draw this because you, let's see, over here. Remember, we're as human beings, we're not so good at drawing accurate lines free-handed. So if you used your ruler, you got nice straight lines. And here we go. We're going to cut this out, cut it on the lines, and once again, I'm using a dull blade in my rotary cutter in order to cut this out. And it's so easy. And I can be a little more accurate cutting it out this way than if I do it with scissors. I think part of that is because I've quilted so long. I'm very good with the rotary cutter now, just out of having to use it so much. Not so good with scissors anymore. I used to sew garments, was very good with scissors then, but things change, times change. Okay, we're almost through cutting, and here we have our 8x4 rectangle. And there it is. I've cut it out. Now I need to make two more cuts. And I'm sure you've figured out by now I have to cut it on the diagonals, because it's when I cut this apart on the diagonals that I really begin to get my templates. So I'm going to use my ruler again, and I'm cutting from corner to corner. Now, I can take 1/2 of this and put it aside because here are the two templates. You can see that. There's template A and template B. So I need to only cut on this line now. And now I have my two templates and I want to identify them. So I put an A on this one with a red pencil. Don't have any trouble seeing that. And a B on the other one. And now that I have those, it's very hard to use them the way they are because paper is thin and flimsy, and you will want to be able to trace around your template. So in order to get them so they're more usable, this is what we do with them. Get an old piece of cardboard, an old folder, your template plastic. I just love cardboard. And you get cardboard in a variety of ways. And when these little pieces of cardboard come into your house, find a special place to keep them because there are so many ways you can use them in quilting. And not the least of which is to make templates. So I've got my templates on this piece of cardboard glued down, and you can use just a kid's glue stick. That's all you need. And glue it and let it dry. And so these have dried. Now I need to cut them out. And here's something you are going to remember. When you cut these out of the cardboard, be sure to add the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all around. One of the reasons they are not glued right close together, I had to leave room so that when I cut them out, I can include the seam allowance, and I'm going to do that right now. And remember, I've got this nice dull blade here in my rotary cutter that will allow me to do that very easily. And since it's cardboard, it's much easier to use the rotary cutter than it is to use scissors. Now I'm going to find the 1/4 of an inch measurement on my ruler, and I'll lay that on the edge of the template, because I have to add a seam allowance all the way around the template so that when we sew the pieces together, we have them just as they need to be. And I'm just cutting along the edge of the ruler. And you can see that I'm adding to the template. And in a minute, when I get it all cut out, I will show it to you. And I'm taking a little time because I want to make sure I have that 1/4 of an inch mark on the edge of the paper, because that allows me to add the 1/4 of an inch. You can see so far. Look at, I hope you can see where I've cut, and you can see that I'm adding 1/4 of an inch around the graph paper. And I'll cut the third side, and then you can see it very easily. Make sure you take your time when you're doing this. There's no need to rush. And make sure everything is cut before you move the triangle. I'm moving the scrap first. Okay, I pull the scrap off because I want to make sure that this doesn't get handled too much. Now, it didn't go all the way through yet, so I'll work with that and get it through. Remember, this is a dull blade. It's not one of my brand new sharp blades. And so it might take a while, but it's one of the best ways I know to get this job done. A lot easier and a lot more accurate for me. Oh yeah, it's coming. And even though I'm going through the same cut, I still use the ruler. I don't trust myself to just eyeball this and say, oh, that's it. Because I want this to be accurate when I cut the pieces out for my block. Okay, here we go. And if this happens to you, don't worry. Just take your time until you get it free. Okay, there is template B, and now I need to cut out template A. Notice the seam allowance around template B. It's the seam allowance beyond the graph paper. That's what you want, so that when you cut your fabric, you will be including the seam allowance for each piece that you cut. And I'm going to see if I can get this to go all the way through on the first cut. Oh yes, okay, I'm doing a much better job this time. Oh yes. Oh, see, that came right out. And I just need to do the bottom. And let's get that done now. And then we will talk about how often you have to use these templates to cut the fabric for the block. Okay. Here are our two templates. Template A and template B. And you make them yourself. You don't have to have the ones that came with the book. And in order to make these a little more user-friendly, I'm going to use my scissors and cut off these long tips. And so we can cut this, kind of eyeball this. And once again, that's beyond the graph paper. And so we can do that with both of our templates. It just saves a little bit of fabric, saves some of those dog ears that you get when you sew triangles together. Okay. So now you have the two templates that the block says are needed in order to cut the parts to make this block. Now if you look at the different fabrics and look up close, and it will tell you how many times to use each template. The gold dot fabric, you need 4 of template A. The green print fabric, you need 4 of template B. The beige print, you need 4 of template A again. Here's A. And then the dark green print, you need 4 of template B again. So you're going to use both templates more than once. And I even made a template for the 4-inch square in the middle. And I did that in the event that I want to fussy cut something to make the middle. I would have that 4-inch square there to help me with fussy cutting it and to make sure that I got whatever design I was trying to get in the middle, right smack dab in the middle. And let's show you that. Here is my 4-inch square. And once again, I did it with graph paper, cut it out using my rotary cutter. And you can see that I have left a seam allowance all the way around. So it's really cut 4.5, but it's going to sew down to 4. Okay, now we have our pieces that we need for the block. You've got your templates and you're ready to cut all of the pieces that you need to sew together for your block. And I'm going to get my fabric and show you where we go next. Those of you that looked at the introduction to the sampler quilt will remember that I am using 5 fabrics. 3 are African prints and 2 are neutral fabrics. And so here are the fabrics I've chosen out of my 5 that I want to use in this block. So here are my neutrals, and that's template A, template A, template A, 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 A. And then template B are these triangles that you see all around. One other thing I want you to notice is you should see that rectangle, the original rectangle with which we started. You should see that, and here it is. If I place this right here, there is this triangle, and here is this one. Here is this triangle A, triangle A. So essentially, to put this block together, we really have to sew that rectangle back together. We're going to sew an A to a B like this, and an A to a B like this. Once they are sewn, then we put one long seam to sew, one long diagonal together, which is why I wanted to point out to you how you were getting your templates, because now that you have the templates, you're sewing the original rectangle back together. Now, you're going to handle these pieces of fabric very little, only what you truly need to do, because you have some bias edges. Remember, when we work with triangles, we are likely to get some bias edges, and there are several bias edges here. So handle your fabrics very little. Pick them up, take them to the sewing machine when you're ready to sew them. Don't handle them too much, and sew slowly so you don't have to take a seam out. When we rip seams out of triangles, we distort the fabric and we really can't get it back to the way it was. So you almost have to cut new pieces out, and no one wants to do that. One other thing I have to mention to you before we start sewing. When you sew A to B like this, here's A and it's laying across B, you want to make sure that A, that when the A is extending beyond the top of B, that it extends 1/4 of an inch. If it doesn't, the rectangle doesn't go back together as it should. So can you see that little 1/4 of an inch sticking out? And you start sewing right in this V. The seam starts in that V, and you will have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way down, as long as you start by having that little tab right there. That has to measure 1/4 of an inch above the piece, the B triangle. Can't stress that enough. And you can hear that I probably know what I'm talking about from experience, because I had to take some things apart and it was upsetting to me. So I'm going to just tell you that little tip of the A template must extend 1/4 of an inch above the B template, and you start sewing them together in this little V that is created right here. You do that and sew slowly, and you will have the seam that you need. The other thing I caution you about, A really is not an equilateral triangle. All the sides of A are not the same. This side and this side have the same measurement. This has a different measurement. So my suggestion is lay your pieces out like this, so you know exactly what side of A to sew to the B triangles. I'll say that again. Lay your pieces out so that you will know exactly what side of the A triangle has to be sewn to the B triangle. If you do this, it doesn't work. It may not look like it to you now, but if you turn that on the side, it isn't going to work, and you're really going to get some distortion because you will be exposing a biased edge. So lay all of your pieces out. Rectangle, 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 surrounding a square, 4-inch square. And then you're going to sew all of your rectangles together. We'll do all of these, and then I will show you how to attach them to the center square. So I'm going to sew a little bit, come back and show you as I sew the various seams. I've sewn 2 of these together, but I want to stop at this point and share something with you before I press them. Notice how my seam starts. I've got that 1/4 of an inch tab sticking out from template A, and see how the seam starts right in that V, right there. That's what I want you to do. And I've done that on both of these. Need to clip a thread, but you want your seam to start right in that V. There's a lot of thread right there. And when you do, you'll notice you get the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. That's what we need. So now I'm going to press these and show you what they should look like once they've been pressed. Now that I've pressed the pieces, let's look at where they will fit again in the block. There's template A, template B. And once again, template A, template B. And when you make sure you've got that little tip from A, that's 1/4 of an inch, you get a nice straight line here. This one is a little bit straighter, but that's what you want, is you want it to look like it's just straight across. And one of the ways of doing that is to make sure that little tab that's now laying down was sticking up 1/4 of an inch above the B template. And notice that I press my seams toward the B template. I think they lay better and just seems to work better for me. So now my task is to take these two pieces and sew them together. I'm just going to flip them over, and I want to put a pin where the two seams cross. So I want to make sure that that is 1/4 of an inch. So I have to stick a pin right there at the 1/4 of an inch mark and make sure it comes through both seams, because they really must match. There we go. See, I've got a pin in there, so now I can straighten everything up and make sure that pin stands up. And now that it does, I can push it down and know that using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I'll show you the front, I'm going to be able to sew these together very easily, and the two seams that were sewn earlier will match and will be in just the right place. All right, I've sewn that seam, and here is my rectangle. And here is what I was telling you that you want to happen. You see how those two seams come together so well there, and you get that little point? That's what you want to do when you're sewing. Sew slowly, pin before you sew, and that will happen for you. So here is the first rectangle complete, and later on I'll clip the dog ears off, but I'm now going to sew the rest of the rectangles together and show you those, and then show you how to connect those to the center square. Here's the initial seam. It's the seam that I told you you want to go about 2.5 inches and stop. I'm just going to finger press the seam allowance for the time being, because I have to do something. I have to finish this seam later on. In fact, it will be the last thing we do in putting the block together. So right now I'm finger pressing it open, and I'm going to lay it down, and it goes right here. See? That means that I've got this edge of that unit that I just sewed. I've got a nice long edge. I'm going to pick up this rectangle, turn right sides together, and sew this rectangle, and it will go across the red square into the first rectangle that was sewn. I've sewn the second rectangle on. You can see how it's coming together. I've sewn it to the red square and to the first rectangle. Now I am going to sew this rectangle to this unit just like this. And you will see this technique used in a lot of projects when you have to go around a center square, that you start with a partial seam. So all of the other objects around that center square, and then go back and finish the first seam, which is what I will do once I finish sewing the next two squares on, this one and the last one. So one more rectangle has been sewn to the unit, and so we now need to sew that last rectangle on that will go right across here. And when that one is on, the last thing we will do is complete this seam down here. Okay, I've sewn that last rectangle on, and now I need to finish the first seam. And you can see now how this technique works so well for letting you get all of the rectangles, squares, whatever shapes you have around that center square, and then finish what you started at the very beginning. And at the beginning we started with about a 2.5 inch seam, and now we're going to finish that seam. I've finished sewing and pressing that final seam, and here is our block. Beautiful, just beautiful. And there's so many great things going on in that block. It's a block with a whole lot of moving parts, I grant you that. But if you just take your time and follow what you know about stitching with good stitching and quilting, you shouldn't have any problems. I like the fact that you see an inner square going around, and you see these triangles that stand out. I also like the contrast between this dark fabric and the light fabrics that are around it. And it makes this blue square really pop out. And the square is lying on a diagonal. Now, just to recap some things, in this particular block, you learn to make your own templates. And remember, we started with graph paper. You drew the rectangle on the graph paper, an 8x4 rectangle. Then you drew the diagonals for the rectangle, and then you cut the rectangle out and you cut it on the diagonals, and you got your two templates for your block. You took the templates and you glued them to cardboard or something stiff so that you could trace around them. I didn't say much about that. My suggestion is don't try to cut around them. Your rotary cutter may start shaving it even though it's cardboard, and your first set of pieces that you get from the template will be accurate, but the latter set may not, because the template may have been altered a little bit. So just take your pencil, marker, whatever you have, and trace around them, and then cut out on the line that you traced. Once you've traced them, and I'm going to hold this up again in a minute so you can see exactly what you need to do, how many of each you need. Once you trace them and cut them out, then they're ready for you to make some to use with your fabric, and you have to make some fabric choices and fabric decisions. I told you in the introduction to the sampler quilt that I plan to make 15 blocks, and I plan to make 2 of each block. And so I do have a second block to go with this. And I really love both of them equally. But this is the other block that I made out of Sweet Tweets. And I did some fussy cutting. This blue you can see was done, that was some fussy cutting that I wanted just that part of the blue to go into this block. and it added to the movement. This block looks like it's just spinning and spinning and spinning, and I wish I could stop it, but I can't. The blue spin, and then that inner circle, the inner square that's on the diagonal, that's spinning around. And so it's just a very, very pretty block. And once again, a lot of times I decide what I'm going to put into a block, what fabrics, but I am not always sure how they are going to work together and what the block will eventually look like. Because I like the serendipity characteristic of quilting. And so when I got this, I was just so overjoyed. Didn't quite know that's how it would look, but am glad that it does look that way. And so these are the two blocks from Sweet Tweets. And now we're going to be on to block number 5, and that should be coming up for you shortly. Thank you again for sewing along with me and for being a part of my sampler quilt.